Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Finch. So, the one thing that I think immediately will probably come out of this, or come out of people's mouths, is probably say this movie feels too short. It's a really good film. I can enjoy this film, but I think what kind of came out of my noggin as this movie's to roll credits, I'm like, man, this movie was really short. Like I felt that I didn't really get the cusp of everything. It's just enjoy this road trip like event that really doesn't go enough of anywhere in the time that it's allotted. I could still enjoy this film. I can still say that I would probably recommend this film compared to everything else that's coming out right now, just because I feel like this movie is much more enjoyable than anything else. But it just feels that I didn't get anywhere in this movie. Like I feel like this is only going to be a one-off film, or maybe if we are to get a sequel film, then like I'm sure it's probably going to get lost in the shuffle because what are they really going to call this film? Jeff? I don't know. But for this film, what is this film about? So that way people could go out of their way to say that they are to seemingly know something about this film. So it seems that the world had gone into having a solar flare event, which caused it to be seemingly impossible to want to go outside during the day. Because if you are to basically put your hand outside of the sun, every human is to, or pet or animal or whatever, are to basically turn into vampires, seemingly, where it seems that they are to be in pain, they are to be hurting, they are to, of course, be scorched by the sun, and so people and animals are to avoid at all cost trying to go out into the day to have our robot character eventually saying, well, why don't you just drive at night? And Finch, who is Tom Hanks's character, is to just go, like, it's so unsafe to drive at night. Like, it's much more safer to drive during the day. But I can see where Jeff is coming from. Like, if people were to do more active things at night than during the day, then they would possibly be able to live. Uh, but so, from time to time, we end up getting these stories that Finch's character just decides to talk to Jeff and tell him these stories that I guess is to help us understand this world, but again, not quite enough. But we do get some like emotional things going on here. The struggle of Finch having to try and talk to a robot that seems intelligent but isn't all that quite there in the intelligent department, where it seems that this robot can give you kind of random information, but it seems that it has difficulty doing common things, or where Finch is to be consistently frustrated about this robot is because it doesn't exactly have common sense, or because it's a robot. Like, it just kind of is zeros and ones, and it just doesn't grasp or understand everything. So it's a interesting road trip movie because really this is what it just boils down to being, is just a post-apocalyptic road trip like movie where Finch's character is just wanting to give up where he is to be at when we start this film to make his way on to seemingly another location to put together one last road trip to, I guess, be able to find more items, scavenge more, because it seems that things are running low from where Finch is to be picking from. So, with that said, how did I overall feel about this movie? What would be my grading system for this film? Like I would say, I think this movie is kind of better than a lot of stuff that is out there. It does have that Apple TV goofy app thing, and so I would recommend a lot of people kind of avoiding that by going out of your way to go into a number of apps that probably has this movie available. But like I first saw this on, and you might have to Google search this app when I talk about this. So immediately I found this movie on Fox HD Movies. So if you go on Google and you put in the words Fox HD Movies and Google search that, you should be able to have an app pop up that says Fox HD Movies, but the title of the app will say something different. It'll be like Play 1080p, whichever. I think eventually it'll probably arrive on another app that I've been using consistently called Letter C Movies. So C Movies, it's two words. You can go onto Google and search that also and download that app, and you should, with the combination of those two apps, you should roughly be able to see almost everything. There might be other apps that I could say you could conveniently find, like a TV Crush, that could also kind of conveniently help you find a lot of movies, or just other, like go and just search on the Google Play Store and just search movie apps. You'll probably conveniently find a bunch of stuff that you'll just kind of choose whichever is to best benefit you, especially if you want to watch a lot of new releases for absolutely free and not have to pay XYZ fees and all that garbage. Sometimes there's bootleg movies that you can watch, like bootleg theater movies, so you don't even have to go to the theater either. Like I do that a lot. So, but how did I feel about this movie? So, it's better than a lot of stuff that's out right now. Overall, I would just say that this is kind of like, it's an okay piece. Like it's kind of a very uh like it's an interesting film because you have Tom Hanks's character having to consistently ridicule this robot character throughout this whole entire film, because the robot character does a lot of mistakes because he doesn't know any better, and Tom Hanks has to go on and have to tell this robot, it's like, hey, freaking grow up. Like, help me. Like, if anything, like, you're not. So, like, you need to learn, you need to know how dangerous this world is for me and for this dog. And your main mission is to always protect this dog. And like protect this dog until it eventually passes away. So so I would say check this movie out if you can eventually conveniently find it somewhere else besides a Apple TV Plus whatever thing. If you already have that app anyways, because there's a number of shows that you want to see anyways, because I think the Jason Momoa C show is possibly on that app. I think like Invasion is possibly on that app right now. I think there is some decent content that is coming off of that app, so you can even justify having a subscription for that app if you deem so, because it seems like there is some pretty decent content coming from that app. If you have the money to blow on another app, I would probably recommend that, because it seems that things are starting to come off of that seem to be of good quality from what I've seen. So, with that said, let's just go into spoiler time about this one. I kind of like that's the teeing up version of this movie. There's like anything else that I'm really to say about this film is to just kind of go into spoilers because really there's like it's very like it feels like a very short film and it feels like it's a very simple film also like it like it barely tells you how the world really ended here. We could have Tom Hanks try to explain things, but there's not enough to really grasp here. It's just an enjoy the ride kind of film, and whether your opinion is good, bad, or indifferent about it, then it is what it is. Because people could have a wide variety of different kind of opinions about this film. People could say that this movie sucked. It's the worst movie that came out, or people could say that it's the best movie that came out this year, and every opinion in between. So, with that said, let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, beginning of the piece is to have Tom Hanks' character seemingly like driving this huge rigged dump truck and smashing through cars, crushing through cars, uh, trying to make it through this one stretch of sandy road to, I guess, make it to this grocery store where the only thing that is really left there is to be a can of dog food where Finch is to be happy that it's like yeah like Goodyear's gonna Goodyear's gonna eat good tonight. Goodyear is of course to be the dog. We also have a robot in the beginning of this film that Finch, Tom Hanks's character, is to have named Dewey, but eventually that robot runs its course, and Finch is after that deciding to go and build another robot that is to be called Jeff. It takes him a while to come up with the name of things. Like this kind of feels like a lot of this movie kind of has like a thing of like Castaway, where if Castaway was to have had like a sequel kind of thing, because Tom Hanks is like he's honestly carrying this movie by himself, but like there of course is this like CGI'd like robot, and that is to have dialogue with Hanks's character, and so we like if anything it's kind of like an I Am Legends kind of movie without like zombies or without much of any other people. Like Tom Hanks goes into a story talking about a little girl who had a gun in her hand, and Tom Hanks was going to some grocery store grabbing a can of noodles, and he ended up hearing some screaming going on outside of this store, and this is a completely different story than like where we're at right now, but I'll get back to it. So Finch goes on and is to hear this hollering about this little girl, this woman, and this man, and they're all screaming and shouting and whichever. All of a sudden, the gun of this girl is to go off. And so it seems that at that moment, Finch, instead of going off to protect this girl, going off to see what had happened or whichever, or to try to prevent people from killing one another, he became a coward at that moment. He was too scared. He had he saw a girl with a gun, and he didn't want to die at that moment. But the good thing that came out of that story is eventually Finch was to find something. He eventually was to find this dog Goodyear, and like that's a really compelling, like kind of saddening story that came out of that chaos where Goodyear was this puppy, and I guess Tom Hanks, because he became a coward at that moment, really wanted to find and protect Goodyear because of that moment of weakness. So, but let's backpedal. So, Tom Hanks goes, finds a can of dog food, and then is to continually dump trunk his way to make it back home, to make it back to his hideaway. And so, of course, Hank is there, or Finch is there, having this robot Dewey, and Finch is putting together this much larger robot, almost life size to him, but a little bit taller. We find out also that this robot is to really benefit Finch's character in a lot of ways. It seems that this robot, which eventually gets named Jeff, seems to have a super strength to him. Seems at some points to be very helpful when even Finch himself is to make mistakes. But we'll get to those moments. So Finch is putting this robot together and is needing to go and take the eyes of Dewey away so that way he can put into this new robot that is going to be much more beneficial. And so by the time that Finch decides to leave, now having this other robot that's going to help him during his time and help out Goodyear, because that's his real mission, it seems that Jeff is to be given the 3 laws of robotics. And like this all kind of harpens back onto like the Will Smith movie I, Robot, where it seems that like we never really cared about robotic like laws until I, Robot came out, and then they're like, oh, okay, so now like every single robot has to have a rule now where it's like, hey, um protect Finch's character, protect the dog's character, and like and so on and so forth, uh, and also like protect yourself, but like without the exclusion of the other 2 rules. So as they are like as Finch is to have given this robot a certain download of information because he is to only have, I guess, 70% of his download being done. And so Finch is to tell Jeff, it's like, well, no one can really be Einstein. And plus, also, like, I'm sure with Finch, it's just like, well, like, it just it just leaves Jeff to have the ability to at some point learn some things or another. But I would just be like thinking like why wouldn't he have left him the time to download all this the rest of this information? Like did they have to go as quickly as possible? Did they really have to leave this location because he just didn't have enough food left? Because it seems like there is only a specific number of cans, like peaches and stuff like that, for them to survive. So all of a sudden, Finch is to have these number of postcards plopped all over this table, and so Jeff is starting to see these postcards and is like, "Oh, okay, so which place should we go to?" And Finch is just like, well, because Jeff is kind of is kind of grabbing certain postcards and is kind of interested in certain locations, and Finch is just like, well, that's good and great and all, but I don't think we're gonna have enough time to make it to these certain locations. We're gonna at some point probably lose gas or any number of things. Because I want to kind of leave something close to the vest until we actually have to get into this. The real mission of why they're leaving, why they're going off, why they're doing what they're doing. So, so Finch goes and is to say that probably the only real location that they're going to be able to make it to is San Francisco. And so Jeff is like, okay, that sounds great. Let's go there. So they pack up. They go into this South Wind RV, some kind of custom made RV for this film, because there's to be like solar panels on the roof of this RV, and like I think it's called like South Wind. It has some kind of goofy wordages to it that like I'm not like you could probably look it up because I ended up seeing that there was like a South Wind RV something that was custom made for this film. So of course they would because they have to custom make everything. So especially for a movie, it can't just be a normal looking like plain whatever vehicle. It always has to be some kind of like goofy futuristic kind of thing or whichever. That always has to be just presented for a film and one of a kind for a movie. So they get going, and so they go off onto this road trip, and it seems consistently that Jeff is asking or offering to drive this RV, and consistently Finch is to tell him it's like, you know what, I don't think I can trust you to drive just yet. Like, if anything, Jeff was just like born yesterday, and so Finch can't exactly trust Jeff behind the wheel. So while they're going on in this road trip, now uh, Jeff is to ask for a name because they didn't have a name for him. And so Finch is starting to rattle off some certain things. And also Jeff is starting to rattle off certain names that either sounds like a dog or like sounds like William Shakespeare or like something that just doesn't quite uh, like fit Jeff individually. And so Finch comes to the idea that whatever name that this robot is to be called has to be short and has to be like his own kind of name. And so the robot is like, well, how about you just call me Jeff? It's really short, right? And so Finch is like, all right, like Jeff, sure, fine. And so yeah, you would have thought that they would have come up with like William Shakespeare, just call him like William or Will. Like what does it really matter? Probably could have called him 1 2 3 and it probably wouldn't have mattered. But they call him simply Jeff. So like of course, what if they seriously would have called this robot, what if they would have called him Wilson? I think that would have been hilarious to have like a callback to Castaway. But like really you probably wouldn't have done that just because uh a lot of people were like, oh, this is just like Castaway, or a lot of people would probably not have liked that just because it's basically like Wilson should have been a one of a kind like thing. Even though, when really looking at it, if we were to have ever had Castaway 2, uh, we would probably have that volleyball uh, kind of redone in the image of what Tom Hanks's character in that movie, uh, and would have just recalled him Wilson, so on and so forth. Pushing on. So road tripping, they stumble upon this seemingly diner. So Finch purposely parks as close as humanly possible to this diner to get into spots of shade so he can avoid the sun. And once Finch ends up making it into the diner, Finch starts horrifically coughing. We start to see some parts here and there where Finch is coughing, and I'm like, oh no. To when we make it to the diner, coincidentally, Finch is to be coughing right where there's a bucket for him to cough in because Finch is coughing up blood. Finch is dying. And so Finch goes out of the diner and is to ask or no wait. Finch goes out of the diner because Jeff had took it upon himself to start driving Finch's car, and so Finch has to kind of run out to stop Jeff from getting further on with his car. Finch is desperately pleading for the robot to stop, and eventually he does. Jeff gets out of the car, mentioning that supposedly the car had started to roll off, which it didn't. Jeff just got into the car and started playing around with it and started driving it a little bit. Because I guess he didn't realize what he was actually doing at the moment. So Finch now has Jeff kind of pulled out of the RV by Jeff kind of walking out of the RV because Finch now can't make it anywhere closer to the RV because what Jeff had done here. And so now Finch has to explain to Jeff that he cannot now walk to where the RV is because he puts out his hand next to the sun to have his hand starting to burn. And so Finch tells Jeff to go and get him his UV suit and to also grow up. Because, yeah, I know he was technically born yesterday, but, like, it's time to really grow up. And it's time to stop being this overly curious person and to try and help Finch. Or otherwise, this is going to be all for nothing. That Finch might possibly die, and Jeff is just going to go off and do his own thing and destroy himself. And then what will all this be for? So Finch goes with Jeff, and like we have points where kind of Dewey is just kind of left to just consistently power down, because normally before Jeff, like we had both Dewey and Finch kind of going out on missions, but since now Jeff is out there, like Dewey can just power down a lot. And so so Finch and Jeff, like Finch is to finally showcase to Jeff how to drive, like in this very like desert like road. And so they go off, and so Jeff of course is trying to drive, and it seems that he's doing a good enough job, but Finch is consistently trying to correct him and trying to like show him what they're supposed to do. And then he's also telling them that they need to consistently get under like 50 miles an hour, and they might make their way to San Francisco, especially if Jeff is to drive while possibly Finch is sleeping. And so it seems that Finch is doing a good enough job, but I would always be freaking worried that eventually Jeff is going to crash into something. That at some point Jeff is going to destroy this vehicle, and that might possibly become a thing. Because what ends up happening further down the road is that uh, Finch and Jeff go out scavenging together, and so Finch takes him to this movie theater and kind of tells him the lay of the land of trying to one tell him about the solar flare story and that the moon is supposedly made out of Swiss cheese. So they go into this movie theater and Tom is having difficulty getting through the door, and Jeff goes and muscles this door open, and Finch is like, well, that's brute strength, but maybe that's a little bit too much brute strength. So they go into the movie theater and all they can really find is like popcorn kernels, and so now they just decide to just have fun because that's all they can really do and kind of enjoy the little things. So hilariously, what ends up happening is Tom Hanks has this 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 tire plate. I don't know what the actual name is here for like a car part. So he takes this item and puts popcorn kernels on it, and when the popcorn hits this metal piece, it actually pops into popcorn fairly quickly because I guess because of the sun's rays, it kind of is to be similar to a microwave. And so uh and so we have here Finch just having fun with this popcorn, and so like that was kind of a fun moment that we had there. And so Jeff is kind of like, do it again, because he's having fun also. So we push on, and so Finch is driving because it seems that, or Jeff is driving because Finch is starting to get sick, and so Jeff is to notice that Finch is starting to get sick, and so Jeff is like, Finch, what should I do? And Finch says, call a doctor. Call a doctor, because there is none. There is nothing for Jeff or Finch to really do, because sadly enough, Finch is dying. So, but here's the thing. Jeff actually does the right thing here. He gets a cold washcloth and puts it onto Finch's head. He actually kind of, in the best way that he can, actually doctor Finch up for a normal sickness, to, I guess, try and perform being some kind of doctoral kind of person, which was kind of nice. It's like, oh, okay, so Jeff is not completely useless. So Jeff goes off with Dewey to go and do their own mission uh, in this one place. And so it seems that Jeff is to find a bunch of stuff, is to find a bunch of medications, is to find a coat that he rarely tosses on, and both Jeff and Dewey are going like into this place trying to find things. And so all of a sudden Finch is to wake up to see where Jeff and where Dewey is. And so eventually Finch goes into the place where both where both Jeff and Dewey are to find Dewey. Sadly enough, he ends up dying there. He ends up dying in this location. And now Finch is just kind of sad because Dewey had died without Jeff even realizing it. Because Jeff had told Dewey to stay in one location, and Dewey end up dying because of it. So Finch goes and finds Jeff with weird coat and all, and Finch is to scramble to get Jeff out of here because this place is obviously some kind of trap, and that him and Jeff should just scramble out of there because it's naturally to assume that this place was to have been inhabited by somebody, and that somebody is eventually or is going to get to Jeff and Finch because, like, of course, like this place is some kind of camp for some person, and so they're going to get even with these guys going and taking all these items. So both Jeff and Finch drive off, and so all of a sudden there's to be a car following them, and it's kind of blatantly obvious that this person is to be following them because there's only so many cars in this world. So now Finch is trying to figure out some way of losing this guy. And so he decides to drive as quickly as possible, like pedal to metal, but of course Jeff is driving. And so then Finch decides to go and take this really hard turn to make his way underneath this bridge that doesn't have enough clearance for this bridge. And Jeff is to tell him that, but Finch drives into this bridge anyways to hide out. The RV ends up getting stuck because there isn't enough clearance. The solar panels is what's making this vehicle stuck. And so Jeff, trying to make up for this whole problem that he had caused, goes and is to use his brute strength to push this RV in or underneath this bridge so they can hide and have all of this solar panel stuff just crush off of the top of this thing. So the guy is to drive by and is to completely miss where Jeff and Finch are, and so he just drives on. So we're at a moment now where Finch, after this moment, realizing that all the solar panels are, of course, like ripped off of the top of his car, Finch is like, God, I think I'm done. Like I think this is over. I think there's no way I'm gonna be able to get there. There's like I'm gonna probably die before we even get to anywhere. And so we just have reasonably Finch just giving up. And Jeff is like, no, like, let's keep going. Like, let's not give up. So that's, of course, when Finch hits Jeff with this story. Because Finch continues to, like, give stories. Like, Finch tells Jeff the story about the whole solar flares and the moon being, like, Swiss cheese and all kinds of goofy kind of things, which... eventually Finch is to tell Jeff to take like these stories with like a grain of salt, because like the moon isn't literally Swiss cheese. It's just an expression, and so on and so forth. There's just some expressions that reasonably Finch is to make here. So in like we have where when Finch goes off on his own, he tries to mimic or be just like Finch on this journey. And when he's kind of doing his own scavenging, but he's scavenging the wrong person. So they just decide to just go and drive on. Jeff, still seemingly getting sick, or Finch continuing to getting sick, Jeff continuing to just drive on, while course, Finch is resting. So, uh, it seems that eventually they are to make it to the location that they're supposed to make it to. And so when they do actually make it there, Finch is to put on this nice white, this nice white, like blazer and pants and like this hat, and it looks really nice. And so coincidentally, when Finch is to head out into this RV, he kind of is to put his hand out there to check about the sun. But then weirdly, the sun has changed. And so the sun weirdly has changed from no longer being a microwavable skinned problem to now seemingly being back to normal. And so finally, Finch goes out there and just basks in the sun. And so they go on, and so Finch is in this nice suit with this umbrella out, and they're just basking in the sun, just having fun, having Jeff go and toss this ball to Goodyear, toss it back and forth to just kind of play fetch because like they're having fun. And like it's just a repetitive notion and whatever, but it's just all out of fun. So we sadly have Finch, who ends up starting to cough and starts to spray blood upon his suit. He's like, like this is my favorite suit. This is my best suit. And so we get where Finch is to be tired. And so what ends up happening is Finch ends up going and resting to finally pass away. Sadly enough. So next, we have both Jeff and Goodyear, who are to be the only ones left on this journey. And so Jeff is like, well, what should I do next? Like, what would Finch do? So Jeff finds dog food for the dog because, again, Jeff's number one mission is to take care of Goodyear. And so Jeff is to take this can of dog food out of this refrigerator, and he doesn't know how exactly he can go on and open this can, but coincidentally the part of his chest is to be a can opener, and so he's like, oh my god, like, all right. So Jeff feeds Goodyear, and so both Goodyear and Jeff go off to that bridge that was to be on that postcard. And so they see a number of people leaving notes for people, telling them where they're going or something like that. So Jeff is to tell Goodyear, like, well, hey, we're not the only ones. We're not the only ones left here. So Jeff is to go on and leave a note, like a little drawing of him, Finch, and Goodyear, kind of with this postcard and whatever. And so Jeff also goes and buries Finch and ends up saying Finch's name and ends up saying beloved by Goodyear and Jeff, which is like, oh my god, that's such a nice moment. And so really just the end of it is really just both Finch and Goodyear just kind of like making it through their days, just like going off into the sunset and just continuing to adventure, maybe quite possibly going on a road trip that is to make it to all those postcarded locations. We don't know. But if I were to have written the sequel of this movie, that's where I would just head things. Would just be that that Jeff would just go with Goodyear to every single one of these locations on these postcards to find these locations and just kind of leave these postcards by these locations and kind of just continue to do that because what else do they have left to do? And maybe that eventually they'll find somebody along that journey. They'll eventually team up with somebody that is to be a good person or is to need help, and Jeff will help them because he's strong enough. There was also to be the one point in this movie where uh, Finch is to see that his RV was to, of course, like had basically popped a tire, and so Finch is to have to now put a new tire on his car, but he doesn't have a jack, and so Jeff all of a sudden picks up the whole entire he picks up the RV. He picks it up as he's a jack himself. And so Finch performs the replacing of this tire, and then Jeff slowly puts the tire down, and it's like, well, I guess it's a good thing that they had Jeff there that was strong enough to just pick up this truck or pick up this RV and get them that replacement tire, because the one thing that they forgot about was a jack, and you would have thought that would probably been one of the things, but probably out of all the stuff that they grabbed, that was probably the one thing that they were just like, we don't have one, because a lot of times it's just scavenging for certain kind of things, and yeah. So with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this film. I think I covered most of this movie. There might have been something that slipped through the cracks, but oh well. With that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here because of the time that was allotted for this movie, but I'm gonna get out of here anyways. I enjoyed this movie. It was overall a fun thing. It was overall a fun adventure. But with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.